Abigail Brooks read every word of that dismissal letter, the one Nathan Carter had already written, already sealed, sitting open on his desk like a verdict. And then she folded it in half, walked into his filthy kitchen, and started a fire in his dead stove. He was still standing on the porch, still holding that cold coffee, still wearing the face of a man who had already decided. She didn't ask permission. She didn't knock. She didn't explain herself. She just started cooking. If you've ever been told you weren't the right kind of woman, not young enough, not pretty enough, not what somebody ordered, stay with this story. Because what happens inside this broken Montana ranch house is going to remind you that the women this world underestimates are almost always the ones holding everything together. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that frozen Montana morning and meet the woman nobody wanted. "You're not the woman I ordered." Nathan Carter said it the way a man says something he's been rehearsing flat final. No room for argument. He didn't step off the porch. He didn't tip his hat. He just stood there with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and looked at the woman climbing down from the stagecoach like she was a problem that had arrived on his property uninvited. Abigail Brooks heard him. She heard every word. She got her second boot on the ground, picked up her worn leather bag, and looked up at him with eyes the color of river ice in late November, steady clear, and not the least bit surprised. "No," she said. "I reckon I'm not. I asked the agency for someone younger, someone physically—" He stopped. There was no polite way to finish that sentence. He didn't try. "They made an error. They sent me," Abigail said, "because 3 other women refused this post. Bad road, worse weather. 3 children, isolated location, 1 difficult employer." She paused. "Their words, not mine. I'm not here because you chose me, Mr. Carter. I'm here because nobody else would come." Nathan stared at her. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Then you understand, I'll be contacting the agency for a replacement." "You can do that," she said. "How long will that take?" The silence that followed was answer enough. 6 weeks. It had taken 6 weeks to get this one. Abigail didn't wait for him to speak. She picked up her bag and walked toward the porch steps, not slow and not fast, just steady, the way a woman walks when she's already made up her mind. "I'm Abigail Brooks," she said as she came up the steps. "I cook clean, manage a household, and I know how to care for sick children. I won't get in your way. I won't ask for things you can't give, but I'll need to see that kitchen before noon, Mr. Carter, because from the look of this place, those children haven't had a hot meal in longer than any child ought to go without one." She reached the door, stopped, looked back at him over her shoulder. "That's not a judgment," she said. "That's just what I see." She pulled open his front door and walked inside his house, and Nathan Carter stood on his own porch in the freezing Montana wind and did not say a single word because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make him sound like a fool. Inside the house told its story plainly. The kitchen was the worst of it. Dishes stacked in the grim architecture of a man doing only what was absolutely necessary. A pot on the back of the stove with something burned black in the bottom. The floor so layered with tracked mud it had become its own geology. A window cracked at the corner, a rag stuffed in to stop the draft cold air still seeping through anyway. Abigail set her bag by the door, breathed it in, rolled up her sleeves. She was coaxing the stove back to life when she heard the small sound behind her. A breath, a shift of weight. She didn't turn. She'd learned early that turning too fast frightened children who were still deciding whether you were safe. "Good morning," she said to the stove. Silence. "I'm Abigail. I'm going to make some oatmeal directly if that suits you." A pause. Then a small voice, careful and serious. "We don't have much oatmeal left." She turned, then slow and easy. The boy in the doorway was maybe 6, thin in the face, the way children get when they haven't been eating right, with his father's dark eyes, and a gravity that didn't belong on a 6-year-old's face. His shirt was too big. His feet were bare on the cold floor. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ben." "Well, Ben," she said, "however much oatmeal there is, we'll make it work. You know where things are kept." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, crossed the kitchen on his quiet bare feet, and opened exactly the right cabinet on the first try. Quarter sack of oatmeal. Jar of dried apple slices beside it. "Good man," Abigail said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Nathan came through the kitchen 20 minutes later and stopped dead in the doorway. His youngest son was sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of hot oatmeal in front of him, talking in his small, serious voice about the names of all the horses in the barn, and the large woman he'd tried to send away was sitting across from him, listening like those horses were the most important thing she'd heard all year. Nathan looked at his son's face. He looked at the cleaned counter, the fire going in the stove, the pot actually washed. He walked through without a word and didn't look back. Lucas appeared just before noon. 12 years old, shoulders already carrying the set of a boy who had decided the best response to a world that kept falling apart was to work harder than it could. He came in from the barn with mud on his boots and cold on his face, and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Abigail the same way his father had, measuring careful, not hostile exactly, but nowhere near warm. "Who are you?" he said. "Abigail Brooks. Your father brought me on to help with the house." "He brought someone before," Lucas said. "She was gone in 2 days." "I heard." "So why are you still here? He doesn't want you here." Abigail turned from the stove and looked at him directly, the way you look at someone you're taking seriously. "No," she said. "He doesn't. Not yet." Lucas blinked. He hadn't expected that. "But your brother ate this morning," she said. "First hot meal he's had in a while, I'm guessing. And there's bread rising on the counter and something decent for supper tonight. So whatever your father decides today, at least you'll eat." She turned back to the stove. "There's a broken hinge on the root cellar door I noticed when I came in. Cold's getting through. You know where your father keeps his tools?" A beat of silence. Then Lucas said slowly, "Yeah, I do. After you eat, maybe you show me." He ate. He showed her. And when she worked alongside him at that root cellar door, not directing him, not treating him like a child, just working beside him, like he was a capable person who knew what he was doing, something shifted in his face that he didn't have words for yet. Emily was harder. Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway around 2 in the afternoon and stood there without speaking, without moving, without any of the small signals that invited conversation. She was 9, fair-haired, and somewhere behind her eyes there was a door that had been shut hard and hadn't been opened since. Her hair was a disaster. Half pinned, half falling, the work of a little girl who had tried and failed and maybe stopped trying. Abigail looked up from the bread dough and saw her and said her name quietly. Not a question, just acknowledgement. Emily didn't answer. "You don't have to come in," Abigail said. She went back to the dough. "You can stand right there if you want." 30 seconds of silence. Then Emily said very quietly, "Your hands are different." Abigail looked down at her own hands, broad, reddened, capable. "Different from what?" she asked. "Mama's hands were small," Emily said. "She braided my hair every morning. She was fast." A pause that lasted too long. "My hair's been—" She stopped. Abigail felt that unfinished sentence land in the room like something heavy. She waited before she answered, gave it room. "I'm not fast," she said honestly. "I'll tell you that straight out. But I know how to braid, and I've got all the time it needs. If you ever wanted to let me try." She turned back to the dough. "No obligation. Just an open offer." Emily stood in the doorway for another long minute. Then she walked away. But she didn't go far. Abigail could hear her in the next room, not leaving, just being close to somewhere that had warmth in it again, like a child standing near a fire. She wasn't sure yet she was allowed to touch. Supper was beef stew, root vegetables, bread that had risen properly, coffee that was actually strong. Nathan came to his own table and sat down and ate, and did not speak and did not thank her. He got up when he was finished, took his plate to the counter, and walked back to his study. Ben ate everything and asked for more. Lucas ate in silence and ate well. Emily pushed her food around for 10 minutes, and then slowly, quietly ate more than half. Abigail washed the dishes and listened to the wind building outside and didn't expect a word of thanks and didn't need one. Later, when the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, she passed Nathan's study and saw the light still burning under the door. She didn't knock. She left a cup of coffee on the hall table outside his door and went to her room. Small, spare, cold, with a narrow bed and one window that looked out at nothing but dark, and sat on the edge of that bed and pressed her hands together. She thought about the letter on his desk. Return her. Send someone suitable. She thought about Ben's face over that bowl of oatmeal, the hunger in it that had nothing to do with food. She thought about Emily's unfinished sentence and the hair that nobody had been braiding. She thought about Lucas at the root cellar door, working alongside her like he'd been waiting a long time for someone to treat him like he was worth working alongside. She lay back on the narrow bed in the dark. She would not leave. Not because Nathan Carter needed to change his mind about her. Not because she needed anyone in this town or on this ranch to see her differently. But because that boy had eaten this morning, and that girl had stood in a warm doorway, and that 12-year-old had said goodnight to her brief, barely more than a word, but real and deliberate, and those 3 small things were worth more than any welcome she'd ever been given in her life. She would not leave. Down the hall, Nathan Carter sat at his desk and stared at the sealed letter to the agency for a long time. Then he pulled open the bottom drawer and put the letter inside and closed the drawer and sat with his hands flat on the desk in the silence of his own house. From somewhere upstairs, he could hear Ben shifting in his sleep, the small sounds of a child who had gone to bed full for the first time in too long. The house wasn't creaking the way it usually creaked at night, all empty restlessness and cold. It was just quiet, a different kind of quiet than he'd had in months. He didn't let himself examine that. He banked the fire. He walked to bed. He passed the hall table, and the coffee cup she'd left was cold now, untouched. But the fact of it sitting there, the small deliberate act of it, stopped him in the dark hallway for just a moment. He walked on without picking it up. But in the morning, the cup was washed and put away, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and something baking, and his youngest son's voice was carrying down the hall, bright and high and more alive than it had sounded in months, telling someone about the horses again. Nathan stood at the top of the stairs and listened to that voice. He stood there a long time. When he finally came down, Ben was at the table with a picture book open in front of him, his small finger moving beneath the words, reading aloud in his careful way. And Abigail Brooks was sitting across from him with her coffee and her sleeves rolled up, and her full patient attention on every single word his son said. Not performing warmth, not making a show of anything, just there, completely and steadily there. "Go on," she said to Ben, quiet and even. "You had it right. Keep going." Nathan poured his coffee, stood at the counter, drank it in silence. Abigail did not look up, did not acknowledge him, did not miss a word of what his son was reading. And Nathan Carter stood in his own kitchen on the 3rd morning and felt something move in his chest that he had no name for yet, and told himself it was nothing, and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the cold Montana sky. But the letter stayed in the drawer, and the clock that had stopped in this house began in the smallest and most stubborn way possible to move again. The town of Harlow, Montana, had a way of knowing things before they were worth knowing. By the end of Abigail's first week at the Carter Ranch, the talk had already started. She heard it for the first time on a Friday morning, when Nathan sent her into town for flour and salt pork, and a new length of stovepipe. He'd handed her the list without looking at her, and said Lucas would drive the wagon. That was all. Lucas drove in silence for the first 2 miles. Then he said without preamble, "People in town are going to stare. People stare everywhere I go," Abigail said. "I'm used to it." He looked at her sideways. "They're going to say things." "They usually do." Another mile of silence. Then Lucas said quietly, "My father's not a bad man. He doesn't know how to be anything right now, except angry." Abigail looked at the boy. 12 years old, driving a wagon like a grown man apologizing on behalf of his father, like it was his job. "I know that," she said. "You don't have to explain him to me." Lucas turned back to the road. His jaw was set exactly like his father's. "I just didn't want you to leave," he said so quietly she almost missed it under the sound of the horses. She didn't answer right away. She let that sit between them for a moment, gave it the weight it deserved. Then she said, "I'm not planning on it." He nodded once, didn't look at her, but his shoulders came down about half an inch. The mercantile in Harlow was run by a man named Gideon Pratt, who had the particular talent of being friendly and cutting at the same time. He greeted Abigail with a wide smile and helped her with Nathan's list, and managed inside of 4 minutes to ask 3 questions that weren't really questions at all. "So, you're the new girl out at Carter's place," he said, lifting the sack of flour onto the counter. "I'm the housekeeper," Abigail said. "Long way to come for housekeeping work. The agency placed me. That's how it works." He slid the salt pork across the counter. "Nathan Carter's particular about things," he said. "Particular about who he lets near those children." He paused just long enough. "Particular about what kind of woman he allows in his house." Abigail counted out the money Nathan had given her and set it on the counter. "I'm sure he is," she said. "Will this cover the stovepipe as well?" The bell above the door jangled before Pratt could answer. The woman who walked in was the kind of woman a room rearranged itself around. Tall, dressed in deep burgundy wool that had cost more than most people in Harlow made in a month, with dark hair pinned in a way that looked effortless and wasn't. She was perhaps 45, handsome in the manner of a woman who had always known she was handsome and had built a considerable amount of her personality on that foundation. Victoria Langford looked at Abigail the way you look at furniture you're considering returning. "You must be the woman Nathan Carter hired," she said. Not a greeting, a categorization. "Abigail Brooks," Abigail said. "Yes." Victoria moved to the counter with the unhurried ease of a woman who had never needed to hurry for anything. "I heard the agency sent someone unexpected. Nathan must be managing as best he can." She said it with a smile that had nothing warm in it. "Those poor children. They've been through so much. They deserve someone truly capable of caring for them." "They're doing well," Abigail said. "Of course you'd say that." Victoria picked up a jar of preserves from the counter, examined it, set it back down. "I've known the Carter family for years. I was very close with Nathan's wife, God rest her. I've kept a careful eye on those children since Margaret passed." She looked at Abigail directly for the first time. "I intend to keep doing so." The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone is pretending not to listen. Abigail picked up her package from the counter. "Then those children are fortunate to have people who care about them," she said evenly. "Good day, Mrs. Langford." She walked out. Lucas was waiting with the wagon, and he had heard through the open window because his face when she climbed up was carefully, deliberately blank in the way of a boy working hard not to show what he felt. "She does that to everyone," he said. "I know the type." Abigail said. "She wanted to marry my father," Lucas said. "After Mama died, he said no." He picked up the reins. "She didn't like that." Abigail filed that away and said nothing. Back at the ranch, she put away the supplies and started the midday meal, and didn't mention Victoria Langford to Nathan, and Nathan didn't ask about town. But that evening after supper, when the children were occupied and she was cleaning up, Nathan came into the kitchen and stood by the counter with his coffee and said without looking at her, "Pratt talks. Whatever he said, you can discount it." "He said very little," Abigail said. "Victoria Langford talks more." Now he did look at her. "Did you meet her?" "Briefly." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that he shut down before it became anything legible. "She has opinions," he said. "About my family. About who belongs in it." "So I gathered. I manage my own household," Nathan said. The words had an edge under them, but the edge wasn't directed at her. She could hear that. It was the edge of a man who had been managing something difficult for a long time, and was tired of other people having opinions about how he did it. "I don't answer to Victoria Langford." "I didn't imagine you did," Abigail said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he set his cup in the basin and walked out, and Abigail turned back to the dishes and allowed herself a single, quiet breath. It was 2 weeks in when Emily came to her, not in the doorway this time, not watching from a distance. She came into the kitchen on a Tuesday morning when the other children were out, and Nathan was in the barn, and she stood beside the table where Abigail was mending a tear in Ben's coat, and she held out her hairbrush. She didn't say anything, just held it out. Abigail set down the coat. "Come sit here," she said, and pulled a chair around. Emily sat, rigid, braced, like she was preparing for something to hurt. Abigail took the brush and started at the bottom the way you were supposed to, working out the knots from the ends first, slow and careful, never yanking. Emily's shoulders stayed up around her ears for the first few minutes. Then gradually, without seeming to decide to, they came down. "Mama used to sing," Emily said to the air in front of her. "What did she sing? I don't remember the words anymore." A pause. Just the sound of it. Abigail kept brushing, steady, unhurried. "That's the thing about songs," she said. "The words go first. The feeling stays a lot longer." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know any songs?" "A few." Abigail began to braid her fingers slow and deliberate. "Not many pretty ones, I'll warn you." And so she sang. Low and a little rough and nothing like the voice Emily's mother must have had. But Emily sat still and let her finish the braid, and when Abigail tied it off and said, "There," Emily reached back and touched it carefully with her fingertips. She didn't say thank you. She got up and walked out of the kitchen, but the next morning she was back. Hairbrush in hand, same chair. And Nathan, passing the kitchen doorway on his way to the barn, stopped for just a moment when he saw the two of them. His daughter sitting quiet and still, Abigail's broad, careful hands moving through the girl's hair, and stood there with something on his face that he hadn't shown anyone in a very long time before he made himself walk on. The first real fight happened on a Thursday. It came out of nothing the way the worst fights do. Nathan had come in from the range tired and short-tempered and found that Abigail had rearranged the kitchen shelves to make the morning workflow more efficient, and he stood in the middle of his kitchen and said with a coldness that was worse than shouting, "I didn't ask you to change things." "The arrangement wasn't working," Abigail said. "She was at the stove and she didn't stop what she was doing. The children kept knocking things over, reaching across each other." "This is my house," he said. "My kitchen. I'll decide what works and what doesn't." She turned then, looked at him. Let him see that she wasn't afraid of him and wasn't going to pretend she was. "You're right," she said. "It's your house. If you want it put back, I'll put it back." A pause. "But Ben hasn't spilled his breakfast once this week, and he was spilling it every morning before. So you decide, Mr. Carter. I'll do whatever you tell me." The silence stretched between them. "Leave it," he said finally, and walked out. She turned back to the stove. 3 minutes later, the kitchen door opened again, and Lucas came in, looked at her expression and said, "He yelled at me last week for fixing the fence post that was about to fall over." "He's frightened," Abigail said. Lucas stared at her. "My father's not frightened of anything." "Everybody's frightened of something," she said. "The ones who look the angriest usually have the most to lose." She handed him a plate. "Eat your supper." He ate. He thought about what she'd said. She could see him thinking about it, turning it over, testing it against everything he knew about his father. "What's he frightened of?" Lucas asked. Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Caring about something again," she said, "and losing it." Lucas set down his fork, looked at her with those 12-year-old eyes that understood too much. "Like he lost Mama." "Yes." The boy was quiet for a long time after that. Then he picked up his fork and finished his supper and said before he left the table, "I'm glad you're here, Abigail." It was the first time any of them had used her name. The twist that changed everything came on a Sunday. Victoria Langford arrived at the Carter Ranch in a carriage that cost more than most men in Harlow earned in 2 years, with a basket of food she hadn't cooked herself, and a smile she'd been practicing. Nathan was in the yard. Abigail watched from the kitchen window. She watched Nathan's posture go rigid the moment Victoria stepped down from the carriage. She watched Victoria touch his arm and say something that made his jaw set. She watched him look toward the house, toward the kitchen window, and then look away. Then she heard it. Victoria's voice carrying clearly across the yard because Victoria had never bothered to lower it for anyone. "Nathan, you have to see how this looks. A woman like that living in your house around your children. What do people think? What do your children think? You have a reputation in this community. Your children have a future in this community. And that woman..." A pause. "She is not someone who belongs in a Carter household. You know it, and I know it." Abigail stepped back from the window. She pressed her hands flat on the counter. Breathed. Let the hot flush of it move through her and out. She had heard this before. She had heard versions of this her entire life. She knew exactly what Victoria Langford was, had known it from the first moment in the mercantile, and knowing it didn't make it land any softer. It landed the same every time. It always did. She heard Nathan's voice then lower the words indistinct. Then Victoria again. "I'm only saying what everyone in town is already saying." Then Nathan clearly, this time each word separated. "Then everyone in town can mind their own affairs." Abigail's hands went still on the counter. She heard the carriage go. She heard Nathan's boots cross the yard, come up the porch steps, come through the door. She had her back to the door and she was slicing bread and her hands were steady. He came into the kitchen and stopped. "Whatever you heard," he said, "don't." She turned and looked at him. His face was hard and tired, and somewhere underneath the hardness, there was something that looked almost like shame. Not for his own behavior. For someone else's. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Carter," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, something complicated and unresolved and not ready to be said out loud. "Good," he said, and walked out. It was the closest thing to an apology she had ever gotten from him. That evening, after the children were in bed, Nathan came back to the kitchen and sat down at the table, not standing in the doorway, the way he usually did, not holding his distance, but actually sitting down, and Abigail poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked and set one in front of him. He wrapped his hands around the cup, stared at it. "My wife used to rearrange the kitchen shelves," he said. "She was always convinced she'd found a better system." Abigail sat down across from him, said nothing, waited. "She was usually right," he said. He looked up. "About the shelves." "Most women usually are," Abigail said. Something shifted in his face then. Not a smile exactly. Not that far. But the wall came down a 1/4 inch, and she saw behind it just briefly the man who had loved someone and lost her and had been standing in the wreckage of that ever since. And she thought, there you are. There's who you actually are. "Ben's reading is improving," Nathan said. "He's quick," she said. "He just needed someone to sit with him while he did it." Nathan nodded. Drank his coffee. "Lucas fixed the water trough hinge today, the one on the east side that's been giving me trouble for 2 months. He paused. "He said you told him how." "He figured it out himself," Abigail said. "I just asked the right question." Nathan looked at her. Really looked for maybe the first time. "Why do you do that? Do what? Give the credit away?" Abigail held her coffee cup and thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because it matters more that he knows he can do it than that anyone knows I helped," she said. "He's going to need that knowing he can do things for the rest of his life. My name on it doesn't help him." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret would have liked you." It landed softly. He hadn't meant it as anything grand, but Abigail felt it the way you feel the first warm day after a long winter, careful, almost afraid to trust it, aware of how quickly things could turn cold again. "I would have liked her too, I think," she said. They sat in the kitchen in the quiet house and drank their coffee, and outside the Montana wind had gone still for the first time in weeks, and the only sound was the fire in the stove and the occasional creak of the house settling. And neither of them said anything else, and neither of them needed to. It was not a declaration. It was not a turning point that announced itself with any kind of fanfare. It was just two people sitting together in a warm kitchen at the end of a hard day. And it was, Abigail thought, one of the best things she had felt in a very long time. She didn't let herself want more than that. But want it or not, something had changed in the Carter house. Something had loosened. And a loosened thing in the right hands has a way of becoming something else entirely. Something that looks from the outside a lot like the beginning of hope. Nathan drained his cup, stood pushed in his chair, looked at her one more time with that complicated expression she was slowly learning to read. "Good night, Abigail," he said. Her name, not Miss Brooks, not a curt nod and a turned back. Her name. "Good night, Mr. Carter," she said. He walked out. She sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes, listening to the house around her. Ben breathing upstairs, the creak of Lucas turning in his bed, the silence from Emily's room that had begun this past week to feel less like absence and more like rest. She washed the two cups, put them away side by side, and in the morning, when Victoria Langford's words came back to her, a woman like that, she let them come, and she let them pass because the cup had been set out and the cup had been drunk, and Nathan Carter had sat down at his own table and said her name, and not one thing Victoria Langford said could take any of that away. 3 weeks after Victoria Langford's carriage rolled out of the Carter yard, the snow came early. Not the polite kind of early snow that dusts the ground and melts by afternoon. The kind that arrives without warning in the middle of the night and doesn't stop. Nathan had seen it coming in the way the cattle bunched together at the south fence, and the way the sky went that particular shade of yellow-gray that old ranchers recognized the way they recognized a liar's face. He'd spent the day before bringing in extra wood, checking the barn latches, making sure the water troughs wouldn't freeze solid overnight. He hadn't told Abigail any of this. He hadn't needed to. She'd watched the sky the same way he had put up 3 extra pots of water to keep near the stove, doubled the bread she was baking, and made sure every child went to bed with an extra blanket without making any kind of event out of it. Nathan had noticed. He hadn't said so. By midnight, the storm was howling against every wall of the house, and the temperature had dropped so fast the windows were glazed solid on the inside. Abigail was still awake. She was always the last one awake. A habit she'd carried so long it had become nature when she heard it. A sound from Ben's room that wasn't right. Not crying. Not a nightmare. Something thinner than that. A sound like a small animal caught in something it couldn't get out of. She was moving before she was fully thinking. Down the hall through the door, and Ben was in his bed, shaking so hard the frame was rattling against the floorboards. His face in the lamplight, a color it had no business being gray-white, sheened with sweat, his lips faintly blue at the edges. Ben. She had her hand on his forehead before the word was fully out. The heat coming off him was like touching the side of a stove. "Ben, look at me." His eyes opened. They were glassy and too slow. "Cold," he said. "I'm so cold." "I know, sweetheart. I've got you." She was already pulling the extra blanket up, already thinking, already running back through everything she knew. High fever, chills. The way his breathing sounded too shallow, too fast, with a catch in it on the exhale that she didn't like at all. She pushed his nightshirt sleeve back and found the rash she'd half expected red and spreading up from his wrist, and her stomach dropped 6 inches. She went to Nathan's door and knocked hard. He opened it in 10 seconds, which meant he hadn't been asleep either. He took one look at her face and said, "Ben." "Yes, fever's very high. There's a rash on his arm here, this pattern." She showed him with her finger. "Has he had any new medicine lately? Anything different?" Nathan's face changed. "Dr. Henley came out last week, gave him something for the cough he had, a new preparation." "What was in it?" He didn't say exactly. Something with, I think he mentioned quinine." Abigail felt everything in her go very still and very focused at the same time. "Does Ben have a reaction to quinine? Has he ever been given it before?" "Not that I." Nathan stopped, pressed his hand to his forehead. "Margaret. Margaret always said she told Henley once years ago that Ben's skin went wrong when they used that compound for his winter cough. I forgot. I completely— You didn't forget, Abigail said, and her voice was steady because someone's had to be. You didn't know what was in it. That's different. She was already moving back toward Ben's room. The storm means no doctor tonight. The road to town is going to be impossible for hours. We handle this ourselves. Nathan was right behind her. What do we do? We bring the fever down first. Cool cloths, not cold, will make the shaking worse. We keep him awake. We watch his breathing. She was already at the washstand, already working. And we need to stop the medicine immediately. Do you have the bottle? Kitchen shelf. Get it. Don't let anyone else touch it. He went. She sat on the edge of Ben's bed and put her hand on the boy's cheek and said quietly, You're going to be all right. You hear me? I'm right here, and you're going to be fine. Ben's eyes found hers. Something in them, the trust in them, the way he held on to her voice like a rope, made her chest ache in a way she didn't have time for right now. Stay awake for me, she said. Tell me the horses' names. All of them. Start with the gray one. Dusty, Ben whispered. Good. And the bay. Captain. Keep going. Nathan came back with the medicine bottle and stood in the doorway, watching his son recite the names of horses to keep himself conscious, and the look on his face was something Abigail had never seen from him before. Raw. Unguarded. The face of a man staring at something he was not prepared to lose. What else do you need? He asked. His voice was steady, but only just. Sit with him while I get the cloths cooled down properly. Talk to him. Keep him talking. Nathan crossed the room and sat on the other side of the bed and put his large hand over his son's small one. Hey, bud, he said, and his voice was rough in a way it wasn't usually. Captain, huh? You still like that old horse best. He's the smartest? Ben said faintly. He's the stubbornest is what he is. Nathan's thumb moved over Ben's knuckles. Just like someone else I know. Ben almost smiled. You mean Lucas. I mean you, Nathan said. In the doorway, Lucas appeared pale and barefoot, having heard enough to be frightened. Then Emily behind him, her braid from yesterday still mostly intact, her eyes wide and fixed on her little brother. Is he dying? Emily asked. The word landed in the room like a stone. Nathan looked up. Before he could speak, Abigail said from the washstand, calm and certain, No. He is not dying. His body is fighting something that doesn't agree with him, and we're going to help it fight. Both of you come in. Sitting with him is the best thing you can do right now. Emily came in, sat at the foot of the bed, and put both hands around Ben's foot over the blanket like she was anchoring him. Lucas came and stood near his father, and after a moment, Nathan put a hand on the boy's shoulder without looking at him, and Lucas let him. The next 4 hours were the longest of Nathan Carter's life. Abigail worked with a quiet, methodical focus that he could not look away from. She changed the cloths every 20 minutes. She checked Ben's breathing every 10. She talked to the boy steadily. Not soothing nonsense, but real conversation questions that required answers. Stories that required listening, because keeping his mind engaged kept him present, and keeping him present kept him breathing right. Around 2 a.m, Ben's temperature broke. The shaking stopped. His color came back by degrees, the gray-white giving way to something closer to normal. And he fell into a real sleep, deep and even and peaceful, and the room let out a breath it had been holding for hours. Nathan sat beside the bed, with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. Emily had fallen asleep at the foot of the bed, still holding Ben's foot. Lucas was asleep in the chair in the corner, tipped sideways, one arm hanging. Abigail sat in the chair she'd pulled up on Ben's other side, and watched him breathe, and let herself finally feel how tired she was. Nathan lifted his head, looked at her across his sleeping son. You knew, he said. The minute you saw him, you already knew what it was. I suspected, she said. I've seen that reaction before. Where? She was quiet for a moment. I trained as a nurse, she said, a long time ago. Before. She stopped. before things changed. Nathan looked at her. What things? She shook her head slightly, not refusing to answer. Just not tonight, not now. He accepted that. He looked back at Ben's sleeping face for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "If you hadn't been here, I was here," she said. Abigail. He said her name like it had weight, like he was using it deliberately carefully as a thing that mattered. "Thank you," she nodded, didn't trust herself to say more than that. They sat in the quiet room with the storm still howling outside and the 3 children sleeping around them. And Nathan Carter looked at the woman across from him. This woman, nobody had wanted, nobody had sent for, nobody had chosen, and something in him shifted so far and so permanently that he could feel it like a physical thing, like a bone that had been set wrong finally finding its right position. He didn't say any of that. He wasn't built for saying things like that yet, but he didn't look away from her either. Morning came gray and cold, and the storm had blown itself out somewhere before dawn, leaving the world outside, blanketed and still. Ben woke up weak but clear-eyed and asked for oatmeal, which made Emily burst into tears, and then immediately deny that she was crying, which made Lucas pretend he hadn't seen it, which made Ben, confused and pale against his pillow, say, "What's wrong with everybody?" "Nothing," Abigail said, and handed Emily a handkerchief without comment. Absolutely nothing at all. She was in the kitchen making the oatmeal when Nathan came in. He poured his coffee and stood at the counter and watched her work for a moment before he spoke. "I'm sending word to Dr. Henley," he said. "About the quinine. He needs to know." "He does," Abigail agreed. "And I'm going to tell him you're the one who identified it." He paused. "He should know that too." She turned and looked at him. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to," Nathan said. "I want to." His jaw worked for a moment. I haven't been fair to you, since the day you arrived. He stopped, started again. "I've made things harder than they had to be." "You've been grieving," she said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she said. "But it's a reason. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Where did you learn that? The difference between an excuse and a reason." "The hard way," she said. "Same place most people learn the things that matter." He almost said something else. She could see it, the words forming the impulse toward something more than he was used to allowing himself. Then the kitchen door opened, and Lucas came in asking about breakfast, and the moment passed, but it passed differently than moments had been passing between them. It passed like something that would come back around. It was 3 days after Ben's crisis that Victoria Langford made her next move. She didn't come to the ranch this time. She worked through the town the way she always worked when she wanted something done without her fingerprints on it. Abigail heard about it from the butcher's wife when she went into Harlow for supplies. A woman named Ruth Granger, who had a kind face and the particular courage of someone who had stopped caring about social consequences in their late 50s. "She's been saying you're after his money," Ruth said, wrapping the pork chops with more care than the task required, not meeting Abigail's eyes. "Saying a woman in your situation?" She paused, cleared her throat. "Saying a woman who looks the way you do doesn't take a post like this for honest reasons." Abigail held very still. "She's also been saying," Ruth continued quieter now, "that Nathan Carter isn't thinking clearly since his wife passed and that someone ought to speak to the children's welfare." The word welfare landed like a fist. "The children's welfare," Abigail said. Ruth looked up now. Her eyes were direct and sorry at once. "She's been talking to Judge Alcott about whether the Carter household is a fit environment, whether the children are being properly cared for." She put the wrapped package on the counter and pushed it toward Abigail. "I don't hold with any of it. I want you to know that. But I thought you should hear it from someone who doesn't mean you harm before you heard it from someone who does." Abigail picked up the package. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. "Thank you, Ruth," she said. "I mean that." She drove back to the ranch alone. Lucas had stayed to help Nathan with the fence line, and she sat in that wagon on the empty winter road and let herself feel all of it. The rage of it. The particular exhaustion of being a woman who did everything right and still found herself having to defend the fact of her own existence to people who had decided what she was before she'd opened her mouth. She had been here before. Not here exactly. Not this ranch. Not these children. But this place. This particular cruelty of being told in the language of concern and propriety that she was not the kind of woman who deserved the good things in front of her. She'd survived it before. She would survive it again. But when she got back to the ranch and walked into the kitchen and found Emily sitting at the table with Ben's picture book reading to him in her quiet, careful voice. Ben propped up on pillows they'd carried down from his room, wrapped in a quilt, his face still pale, but his eyes bright, and following every word his sister read. Something in Abigail's chest closed around that image and held it like armor. Victoria Langford could say whatever she wanted to, whoever would listen. These children were well. They were fed and warm and healing and being read to by their sister on a cold morning, and that was the truth of this household, and no amount of whisper campaigning could make it otherwise. She started the lunch fire and didn't say a word about what she'd heard in town. She didn't have to. Nathan came in at noon and took one look at her face and set down his coffee and said, "What happened?" Not a question. He knew her well enough by now to read the particular quality of her stillness. She told him. Quietly, without drama, the way you told someone a true thing they needed to know. Victoria. Judge Alcott. The word welfare. Nathan's face went through several things in quick succession. She watched him land on fury and then visibly deliberately push it down somewhere controlled. "She won't take my children," he said, each word separate. Granite. "No," Abigail said. "She won't. I need to go to town. I need to speak to Alcott directly. Nathan." She said his name and he stopped. "Not today, not angry. You go in there angry, and she wins the story." She looked at him steadily. Go in there calm with the truth, and she has nothing. He stared at her. The fury in him was barely contained. But he heard her. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow. I'll go with you if you'll allow it." Something moved in his expression. "You'd do that?" "Yes, even knowing what people will say, what they're already saying." "Mr. Carter," she said, and her voice was quiet and absolutely certain. "People have been saying things about me my entire life. I stopped letting it decide my actions a long time ago." She held his gaze. "The question is whether the truth is worth standing up for. And I believe it is." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll have the wagon ready at 8. That evening, after supper, after the children were in bed, Nathan came to the kitchen doorway and stood there in a way that was different from all the other times he'd stood in that doorway. Less defended, less like a man monitoring a situation, and more like a man who had decided to simply be somewhere. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. "What happened to you before you came here?" He paused. "You don't have to answer." She was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the Montana night was clear and cold and full of stars. "I had a family," she said. "A husband, a little girl." She didn't look at him, kept her eyes on the coffee in her cup. "A wagon accident, 8 years ago, on a road a lot like the one into Harlow." She paused. "I was the only one who walked away." The silence in the kitchen was the kind that had weight and texture. "I'm sorry," Nathan said. And the way he said it, not the reflexive condolence of a man fulfilling a social obligation, but the voice of someone who understood exactly what that loss meant, because he had stood in similar rubble, made her look up. He was looking at her the way you looked at someone you recognized. After that, she said, I wasn't well for a long time, and when you're not well and you're alone and you look the way I look, the world decides what you are very quickly. It decided I was nothing worth looking at twice." She set down her cup. "So I stopped waiting for the world to see me differently. I just started doing the work in front of me. Because the work doesn't care what you look like. The work just needs doing." Nathan crossed the kitchen and sat down at the table. Not across from her this time. beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I looked at you that first morning," he said, "and I saw exactly what I'd decided to see, before you'd said a word." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "I've been ashamed of that." "You let me stay," she said. "You didn't give me much choice." "No," she said. "I didn't." Something broke open in his face then. Not grief exactly, not quite joy. Something that lived in the narrow territory between them, something cautious and real and very much alive. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not grasping, just there, warm and deliberate and asking nothing. She looked down at their hands. His broad and weathered and scarred from years of ranch work. Hers broad and reddened and capable. She turned her hand over beneath his and held on. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. Outside the Carter Ranch, the Montana night was silent and immense and brilliant with cold stars. And inside the kitchen, the fire burned steady and warm, and tomorrow there would be a judge to face, and a town to walk through, and a woman with a burgundy coat who had decided this story was hers to write. But tonight, in this kitchen, with his hand over hers and the children sleeping safe above them, Abigail Brooks allowed herself one thing she had not allowed herself in 8 years. She let herself believe that something good was coming. And Nathan Carter sat beside the woman nobody had wanted and felt for the first time since Margaret died that maybe, just maybe, he had not lost everything after all. They were ready at 8 the next morning, same as Nathan had said. Lucas had been up before either of them had the horses harnessed and the wagon brought around without being asked. And when Abigail came out, he looked at her with those careful 12-year-old eyes and said, "You're going to town to fight for us, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. "We're going to talk to Judge Alcott," she said. "Make sure he has the truth." Lucas nodded slowly. "Victoria Langford gave money to rebuild the church roof last spring," he said. "Everybody in town knows it. Everybody acts like that means she's a good person." "Money can buy a lot of things," Abigail said. "It can't buy what happened in that kitchen with your brother 3 nights ago. And it can't buy the truth." Lucas held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped back from the wagon and said, "Give her nothing to work with." Nathan, coming around the side of the barn, caught the tail end of that and looked at his son with something close to surprise. "When did you get so sharp?" he said. "I've been paying attention," Lucas said, and went back inside. Nathan looked at Abigail. She looked at him. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that Lucas Carter was going to be a formidable man someday, and that formidable men were built in exactly this kind of fire. The road into Harlow was frozen hard, and the wagon moved fast. Nathan drove and didn't talk much, which was his way when he was thinking, and Abigail sat beside him and didn't push. She'd learned the shape of his silences by now, which ones were closed, and which ones were just processing, and this one was the latter. Halfway to town, he said without looking at her, "I want you to let me do the talking with Alcott." "All right," she said. He glanced at her. "You're not going to argue. You know this man. You know this town. I know how to read a room, and I know when to speak and when not to." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I'll follow your lead in there, but if he asks me something directly, I'll answer it." Nathan turned back to the road. "Fair enough," he said. And then after a moment, "Alcott's not a bad man. He's a careful man. Careful men can be moved by evidence." "What kind of evidence does he respect?" "The kind you can put in front of him and point at." Nathan's hands tightened briefly on the reins. "Victoria works in impressions, implications, things that sound true without being provable." He paused. "She's good at it." "Then we give him things he can point at," Abigail said. "Dr. Henley's account of Ben's condition. Lucas and Emily, if he'll hear them. The record of what that house looked like when I arrived and what it looks like now." She thought for a moment. "And the medicine bottle." Nathan looked at her sharply. "The quinine preparation. Labeled in Henley's own hand. Ben's reaction documented. The fact that I identified it, managed it, and kept your son breathing through a blizzard without a doctor present." She met his eyes. That's not an impression. That's a fact with a name on a bottle. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You've been thinking about this." "Since Ruth Granger told me in the butcher shop," she said. "Yes." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant she had surprised him again, and that he was no longer entirely sure why he kept being surprised. "All right," he said. "The bottle comes with us." Judge Alcott's office was at the far end of Harlow's main street above the land records office, up a narrow staircase that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. The judge himself was a compact man in his late 60s, with a gray beard kept short, and eyes that had seen enough human behavior to be neither easily impressed nor easily fooled. He received Nathan with the careful courtesy of a man who had known him a long time, and he received Abigail with the particular stillness of a man reserving judgment. "Nathan," he said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. "Miss Brooks." "Judge," Nathan said. They sat. Nathan put the medicine bottle on the desk between them. "I'll get straight to it." "I'd appreciate that," Alcott said. "You've been approached by Victoria Langford regarding the welfare of my children." Alcott's expression didn't change. "I've had a conversation, yes." "Then I want you to have another one, with me." Nathan leaned forward. "My son nearly died 4 nights ago. Allergic reaction to a medicine Dr. Henley prescribed, quinine compound, which my late wife had flagged years ago as something Ben couldn't tolerate. I didn't remember. Henley didn't remember. The storm had the roads closed." He put his finger on the medicine bottle. "Abigail identified it. She managed his fever through the night with nothing but her training in her hands. When the sun came up, my son was alive." He sat back. "That's what's happening in my household, Judge. That's the welfare of my children." Alcott looked at the bottle, picked it up, read the label, set it back down, looked at Abigail. "You have nursing training, Miss Brooks." "I trained as a nurse for 2 years before personal circumstances intervened," she said. "I've maintained that knowledge." "And you recognize the reaction from the rash pattern?" "From the rash and the fever progression and the breathing changes together, yes. I've seen a similar presentation once before." Alcott was quiet for a moment. "Victoria Langford," he said carefully, "expressed concern about the suitability of a woman in your position living in a household with 3 children and an unmarried man." The word suitability sat in the room like something that needed to be handled with tongs. Nathan opened his mouth. Abigail put her hand briefly on his arm, barely a touch, but he felt it and stopped. "Judge Alcott," she said. "I've worked in households before. I understand the concern. What I'd ask you to weigh is this: those children have been fed every day since I arrived. They've been clothed and schooled and cared for. The youngest nearly died, and I kept him alive. The oldest is learning that he's capable of more than he thought. The middle one braided her own hair this morning for the first time since her mother passed." She held Alcott's gaze steadily. "If there is a single specific concern about my conduct, not my appearance, not my background, not Mrs. Langford's opinion of what kind of woman I am, I will answer it directly. But I won't answer for the crime of being present and useful." The room was quiet. Alcott looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Nathan. Then he picked up his pen and made a note on the paper in front of him. "I'll need a written account from Dr. Henley regarding the boy's medical episode," he said. "For the record." "I'll have it to you by end of week," Nathan said. "Then I consider the matter addressed." Alcott set down his pen. "Nathan, Miss Brooks." He nodded to them both, and it was a nod that meant something. A nod that said, "I see what's here, and I see what isn't here, and I know the difference." They walked out of that office and down the narrow staircase and out into the cold main street of Harlow, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Nathan put his hat back on. Abigail pulled her coat tighter against the wind. "That's not the end of it," Nathan said. "No," she agreed. "It's not. She'll find another angle." "She will." Abigail looked at him. "Let her. Every angle she tries is going to run into the same wall, the truth of what's actually happening in that house." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, standing there on the main street of Harlow, with half the town probably watching from various windows. And then he did something he hadn't done in front of anyone in this town since Margaret died. He offered her his arm. Not romantic, not performative, just offered it. The way a man offered his arm to a woman he was walking with plainly and without apology. Abigail looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then she took it. They walked to the wagon together, and the town of Harlow watched, and Abigail kept her chin level and her eyes forward, and felt Nathan's arm solid under her hand, and thought, let them look. Let every one of them look. Ruth Granger, watching from the window of the butcher shop, smiled so wide her husband asked what was funny. Nothing funny, she said. Something good. It was the fire that nobody had expected. It started 6 days later, on a night that had gone clear and cold after a week of overcast, and it started in the barn. Nathan smelled it first. He'd been in his study later than usual going over the ranch accounts, and some instinct that lived in the body of a man who had worked land his whole life made him lift his head and sniff the air before he'd consciously registered what he was smelling. He was out the front door in his shirt sleeves and running before he'd fully thought it through. The east side of the barn was already going. Not a small fire, not a lantern knocked over. This was too fast, too deliberate in the way it had taken hold of the dry timber, and Nathan felt something cold move through him underneath the heat of the flames that had nothing to do with the night air. He had horses inside. 3 of them. He went in. Abigail woke to the smell. She was at the window before she was fully upright, and what she saw made her move faster than she had moved since the night of Ben's crisis. She was down the stairs and out the door with her coat half on, and she was calling for Lucas as she ran, because Lucas was the one who knew the barn layout, and she was going to need him. Lucas the barn. Lucas, the barn. He was already at his window. I see it. His voice was steady in a way that was terrifying in a 12-year-old. Papa went in. I know. She was already at the barn door. Keep the children inside. Do you hear me? Keep Emily and Ben inside no matter what. Abigail. Lucas. She looked up at him at the window. I need you to trust me. Keep them inside. She went in. The smoke was the worst part. Not the heat, though the heat was enormous. The smoke was the thing that disorientated, that made the familiar strange, that turned a barn she'd been in 100 times into a place with no reliable landmarks. She could hear the horses screaming, and she could hear Nathan coughing somewhere in the smoke, and she pulled her coat up over her nose and followed his voice. She found him at the second stall. He'd gotten Captain out. She'd passed the horse wild-eyed and loose in the yard, but the latch on this stall had buckled in the heat, and he was fighting it with both hands, and the smoke had gotten into him bad. She could hear it in the way he was coughing deep and wet and wrong. Move, she said, and he turned, and for a split second he looked at her in the firelight with an expression of pure shock. What are you doing in here? And she didn't wait for him to process it. She hit the latch with the heel of her hand, the way she'd seen Lucas do it, when it stuck hard and at an angle, and it gave. The horse came out like a cannon shot, and they both pressed back against the stall wall to let it pass. And then Nathan grabbed her arm and said, There's one more. No. She had hold of his arm with both hands. Nathan, you can't breathe. We have to get out. There's one more horse. Lucas, she shouted, because she knew he hadn't stayed inside. She knew it in her bones. Lucas, the third horse. East corner. And Lucas Carter, who was 12 years old and his father's son in every way that mattered, came through the barn door with a wet cloth over his face and went to the east corner stall and got that horse out in 60 seconds, while his father coughed his lungs half out in Abigail's grip, and she held on and did not let go. They got out, all of them. 3 horses loose in the yard, Nathan on his knees in the snow, coughing, Lucas standing with his hands on his thighs, breathing hard, and Abigail with her coat singed at the hem and her eyes streaming from smoke. Emily and Ben were on the porch. Of course they were on the porch. Emily had Ben's hand in both of hers, and they were absolutely silent watching, and the relief on Emily's face when she saw Nathan was something that remade itself in Abigail's memory as one of the truest things she'd ever seen. "Papa," Emily said. Nathan lifted his head, looked at his daughter across the yard. "I'm all right," he said, rough and broken from the coughing. "I'm all right." He wasn't entirely all right. He was going to feel that smoke in his chest for a week. But he was on his feet by the time Abigail got to him, and he was breathing, and his eyes were clear, and his children were safe, and the horses were loose in the yard, and the barn was going to burn down to its frame, but it was going to burn without anyone inside it. Later, much later, after the fire had burned itself out, and the horses had been secured in the small shelter behind the house, and Nathan's chest had been treated as best it could be, and the children had been put back to bed with varying degrees of success, Nathan and Abigail stood in the yard looking at what was left of the barn. "That wasn't an accident," Nathan said. His voice was flat and certain. Abigail had been thinking the same thing since the moment she'd come through the barn door, and felt the deliberate, even way the fire had taken hold. "No," she said. "It wasn't. The latch on the second stall," he said. "It buckled in a way latches don't buckle from heat alone. It was worked on before the fire started." He coughed deep and rough. "Someone was on my property tonight." "Do you know who?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the ruined barn for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, more dangerous than she'd heard it before. "I have a strong suspicion," he said. "I can't prove it yet, but I will." Abigail stood beside him in the cold yard. She thought about the conversation with Alcott. She thought about Nathan offering his arm on the main street of Harlow. She thought about Victoria Langford's face in the Mercantile, the way she'd looked at Abigail like something to be categorized and dismissed. "She's escalating," Abigail said. "Yes." "Because the other things haven't worked." "Yes." He turned and looked at her. His face in the moonlight was all hard planes and exhausted lines, and something underneath both of those things that burned steadier than the fire behind them. "She came after my household through the judge. That didn't work. Now she's come after my livelihood." He paused. "What comes next worries me." "It should," Abigail said honestly. "You should leave," he said. The words came out clipped and difficult, like they cost him something to say. "Not because I want you to. Because she's going to keep coming, and she's going to make your life—" "Nathan." His name plain and direct. "I told you the first week. I'm not leaving. This is different. This is dangerous. I ran into a burning barn tonight," she said. "I'm aware of what dangerous feels like." She held his gaze. "And I'm still here." The silence between them was charged with something that neither of them had fully named yet, though both of them knew what it was. Nathan looked at her, this woman standing in a burned yard in a singed coat with smoke still in her hair. And everything he'd been carefully not feeling for weeks arrived at once, and he had nowhere left to put it. "Why?" he said. And it was the most unguarded thing he'd said to her, stripped of all the management and the distance and the careful maintenance of a man who had decided not to need anyone again. "Why won't you leave? You could find a better post. Easier. Somewhere nobody's trying to drive you out." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. "Because Ben reads to me now," she said quietly. "Because Emily came to me with her hairbrush. Because Lucas told me good night before anyone told him to." She paused. "Because you sat down at your own kitchen table and said my name like it was worth saying." She didn't look away. "I've spent a long time being somewhere that nobody wanted me. This is the first place in years that I've been where I felt like I was supposed to be." She held his gaze. "I'm not leaving that. Not for Victoria Langford. Not for anyone." Nathan stood in the cold yard and looked at her, and stopped trying to manage what was on his face. He reached out and tucked a strand of smoke-dark hair back from her face, one small deliberate gesture, and his hand was warm against her cold cheek for just a moment. "All right," he said. His voice was rough from the smoke, and rough from something else entirely. "Then we face whatever comes next together." "Together," she said. Above them, the Montana sky was enormous and brilliant and cold. And behind them, the barn smoldered in the dark, and somewhere in the house, 3 children slept safe in their beds, and Nathan Carter and Abigail Brooks stood in the yard of everything they were both fighting for, and let the word together settle between them, like a thing that had always been meant to be said. It was Ruth Granger who told them the next morning what she'd seen. She drove out herself, which Ruth Granger did not do. Ruth Granger was not a woman who drove out to ranches at 7 in the morning, and she came into the kitchen where Nathan was drinking his second coffee with the grim, determined focus of a man treating a medicinal substance, and she sat down across from him without being invited and said, "I saw her man Tolliver on the road past your property yesterday evening. The one she pays to do the things she doesn't want her name on." Nathan set down his cup. "You're sure," he said. "I've seen Tolliver's horse often enough." Ruth's voice was flat and factual. "And I know what time your fire started, and I know which direction he was riding." She folded her hands on the table. "I'll say it to Alcott. I'll say it to whoever needs to hear it. I've been quiet in this town for too long about too many things, and I'm done with it." Nathan looked at Ruth Granger across his kitchen table, and then he looked at Abigail, who was standing at the stove, and whose expression said the truth with a name on it, same as she'd told him before the judge. "Ruth," he said, "I'm going to need you to write that down." "Already did," she said, and produced a folded paper from her coat pocket and set it on the table beside his coffee cup. "I'm 71 years old, Nathan Carter. I've watched that woman run this town through charm and money, and the willingness to make people's lives difficult if they cross her. I've been careful and quiet and gotten exactly nowhere." She pushed the paper toward him. "Your children deserve better than careful and quiet." Nathan unfolded the paper, read it, looked up at Abigail one more time. She gave him the smallest nod. "Thank you, Ruth," he said. "This changes everything." Ruth Granger's paper sat on Judge Alcott's desk by 10 o'clock that same morning. Nathan had driven in alone, which was his choice, and Abigail had respected it, because some things a man needed to do without a witness to his own anger. He'd walked into Alcott's office and set the paper down and said 4 words. "Read that, then act." And Alcott, who was a careful man, and a just one, when the evidence gave him no room to be otherwise, had read it twice and then reached for his pen. By noon, Tolliver had been brought in for questioning. By 2 o'clock, Tolliver had decided that loyalty to Victoria Langford was worth considerably less than he'd originally calculated, and had said so at length to 2 deputies and a court recorder. Nathan came home at 3 and walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table, and Abigail set a cup of coffee in front of him without a word, and waited. "It's done," he said. She sat down across from him. "Tolliver confirmed it," he said. "The fire, the barn latch, he named her directly. Alcott has issued a formal complaint. Victoria's attorney was already there by the time I left, which means she knew before I was out the door, which means she has people in that building." He drank his coffee. "She won't face much. Women like her don't face much, but she'll face enough. Alcott made that clear." "What does enough look like?" Abigail asked. "Financial penalty, formal censure, her name on a public record that says what she did." He looked up. "And every person in Harlow who's been careful and quiet around her for 20 years is going to read that record. Ruth Granger's not the only one who's been waiting for a reason to stop being careful." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" Nathan turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Like I should have done this 2 years ago," he said. "Like I let her have too much ground because I was too inside my own grief to fight back." He looked at her steadily. "You changed that." "You changed that," she said. "I just didn't leave." "Same thing," he said. And the way he said it, quiet and certain, closed something in her chest that had been open a long time. Lucas heard the news at supper. He received it with the focused satisfaction of someone who had seen something unjust for a long time and had been waiting for the accounting. He asked 3 precise questions about the legal process, and then nodded once and went back to eating. And Nathan watched his son across the table with an expression that was equal parts pride and something softer underneath it. Emily said nothing. But that night when Abigail came to check on her before bed, Emily was sitting up with her knees drawn to her chest, and she said without preamble, "Is she going to come back, Victoria?" "She'll still be in town," Abigail said honestly. "But she won't be able to do what she did. Not anymore." Emily thought about this. Because people know now. Because people know. Emily was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I heard what she said about you, in town. I heard Lucas telling Papa." She looked up at Abigail with her serious, clear eyes. "She said you weren't a real woman. That you were—" She stopped, started again. "She said things about how you look." Abigail sat down on the edge of Emily's bed. "I know what she said. It wasn't true." "No, it wasn't. You're the realest person I know," Emily said with the particular fierce directness of a 9-year-old who had decided something and was not open to debate. "You're realer than anybody." Abigail looked at this girl, this small, serious, fierce girl who had held her brother's foot through a crisis night and braided her own hair and stood in kitchen doorways waiting to see if the world was safe, and felt something move through her that was too large to name and too true to hold in. "Come here," she said. Emily came. She tucked herself against Abigail's side with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who had decided this was where she belonged, and Abigail put her arm around her and held on. "Thank you," Abigail said quietly. "That means more than you know." "I know it means a lot," Emily said, practical and certain. "That's why I said it." The twist nobody had seen coming arrived on a Thursday 3 weeks after Tolliver's testimony, and 2 weeks after Victoria Langford's formal censure had been read into the public record at the Harlow courthouse. It came in the form of a letter. Not to Nathan, to Abigail. It was from a woman named Clara Hobbs who identified herself as the administrator of the Mercy Nursing Registry in Billings, and it said, in the careful formal language of official correspondence, that a Dr. Henley had written to them on behalf of a Miss Abigail Brooks, detailing her management of a pediatric medical emergency under extreme conditions, and that the registry wished to offer her a position, a real position, a salaried position with standing and credentials at the new hospital being established in Billings. Abigail read the letter twice at the kitchen table in the early morning before anyone else was up. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and sat with it for a long time. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't let herself expect anything for so long that she didn't quite know what to do with an unexpected good thing. A position. Her own position. Her name on something official. Something that said, "This woman's knowledge counts. This woman's hands count. This woman is a professional and not just a person who was useful in a crisis." 8 years ago, she would have wept with relief at a letter like this. She sat with it now and felt the weight of what it meant and what it cost and what it asked her to choose, and she was still sitting there when Nathan came into the kitchen and found her. He read the expression on her face before he read the letter. "What happened?" She handed it to him without a word. He read it. She watched him read it, watched the careful blankness that came over his face, the way he kept his expression managed while his eyes moved over the words, and she knew him well enough now to read exactly what that management was costing him. He set the letter on the table, did not look at her immediately. "Henley did this," he said. "Yes." "He didn't tell me." "He wouldn't have. It's my letter." Nathan was quiet. His hands were flat on the table on either side of the letter. "Billings," he said. "Yes. That's 3 days' ride." "I know." The silence between them had more weight in it than most conversations. Nathan looked up then finally, and his face was open in the way it only was when he'd decided not to manage it the way it had been in the burned yard in the kitchen, with their hands together in Ben's sick room in the long, dark hours before dawn. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with that letter," he said. "I know you're not." "I want to." His jaw worked. "I want to tell you to put it in the stove. I want to—" He stopped himself. "But that's not what you deserve. After everything you gave up, everything that was taken from you." He looked at the letter. "You deserve that. You deserve to have your name on something that counts." Abigail looked at him across the table. "Nathan, don't make this easy on me," he said, rough and honest. "Let me say the right thing even when it's hard." "I'm not leaving," she said. He went very still. "I'm going to write back to Clara Hobbs," she said. "And I'm going to tell her I'm honored, and I'm going to ask her if the position can wait 6 months while I make arrangements here, and I'm going to ask whether Harlow is close enough to Billings to make a conversation worth having about something smaller, a clinic, a part-time arrangement, something." She held his gaze. "Because I am not a woman who has to choose between the work she was made for and the place she belongs. Not anymore. I'm done making that choice." Nathan stared at her. "You haven't asked me yet," she said quietly. "Asked you what?" She raised an eyebrow and said nothing. He understood. She watched him understand. Watched the thing he'd been holding back for weeks move to the front of his face and stay there. Nathan Carter stood up from his chair, walked around the table, stood in front of her, the way a man stood in front of something he was finally done being careful about, and said in a voice that had no management left in it at all, "Abigail, will you stay? Not as the housekeeper. Not as the woman the agency sent." He stopped. Tried again. "Will you stay as mine?" The word mine landed in the room like the first warm day after a Montana winter. Abigail stood up. They were very close, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the gray at his temples, and all the ways this man had been marked by the years of it, and she thought she had never seen anything that looked more like home. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." He exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for months. Then he took her face in both his hands, weathered, careful hands, and kissed her forehead, and held there for a moment, with his forehead against hers, in the quiet kitchen, while the Montana morning came in through the windows, and the stove ticked, and somewhere above them, a 6-year-old boy was starting to wake up, and would want oatmeal in approximately 4 minutes. "I should have said this weeks ago," he said. "You said it when you were ready," she said. "That's when it counts." Ben appeared in the doorway 45 seconds later, as predicted, trailing his quilt hair going in 4 directions, and stopped when he saw them standing close together in the kitchen. He looked at his father, looked at Abigail, looked back at his father. "Are you going to marry Abigail?" he asked with the preternatural directness of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned that some questions required diplomatic framing. Nathan cleared his throat. "I'm working on it," he said. Ben considered this with great seriousness. "You should do it fast," he said, "before she changes her mind." He dropped his quilt on a chair and climbed up to the table. "Can we have oatmeal?" Abigail laughed. She laughed the way she hadn't laughed in years, full and unguarded and real, and Nathan looked at her laughing in his kitchen in the morning light, and the expression on his face was the most undefended thing she had ever seen on a human being. Lucas appeared 10 minutes later and took in the general atmosphere of the kitchen with his 12-year-old precision and said, "Something happened." "Your father's working on something," Ben said helpfully. Lucas looked at his father, looked at Abigail. A slow, deliberate smile crossed his face, rare enough that it transformed him entirely, made him look like the boy he was instead of the man he'd been forcing himself to be. "About time," he said. "Don't push it," Nathan said. "I've been waiting for this since week 2, Lucas said, sitting down. "I'm allowed to have an opinion." The courthouse in Harlow had seen a great many things in its years. Land disputes and cattle thefts and marriages and deaths, and all the ordinary and extraordinary business of a frontier town finding its shape. It had not seen anything quite like the morning Nathan Carter walked in with Abigail Brooks on his arm and his 3 children behind him and Ruth Granger as witness, and told the clerk he needed the marriage registry. The clerk looked at Nathan, looked at Abigail, looked at the children, looked at Ruth Granger, who was wearing her best coat, and an expression that dared anyone to say a single word. The clerk opened the registry. The town had known it was coming. Harlow was not a town that missed things, and the events of the past weeks, Tolliver's testimony, Victoria's censure, Nathan, walking down the main street with Abigail's hand on his arm, had composed a story that anyone paying attention could read. Some of them minded. Some of them had minds shaped by Victoria Langford's years of careful influence, and those minds were going to take a long time to change if they changed at all. But a remarkable number of people didn't mind at all. Gideon Pratt, to everyone's surprise, including possibly his own, tipped his hat to Abigail when they passed the mercantile. The blacksmith's wife sent over a covered dish that afternoon. 3 families Nathan had known for years stopped by in the week that followed, in the way that frontier people marked things that mattered not with ceremony, just with presence, just by showing up. And Ruth Granger, who had been careful and quiet for too long, made it her personal mission to tell anyone who would listen exactly what Abigail Brooks had done for the Carter family, and exactly what kind of woman she was. And Ruth Granger had been in Harlow for 40 years, and people listened to her. Victoria Langford stayed in her house on the hill at the edge of town for 2 weeks after the censure. When she emerged, she was still dressed in expensive wool and still held herself like a woman accustomed to being the most important person in a room. But something had changed in the architecture of her authority. The people who had deferred to her out of caution were weighing that caution against what was now on the public record, and the math was coming out differently. She did not come to the Carter Ranch again. The wedding happened on the first day of genuine spring, when the snow had pulled back from the fields, and the ground was starting to breathe again, and the Carter Ranch looked the way it looked in Nathan's best memories alive, working full of the ordinary noise and motion of a household that was functioning. It was small by design. Nathan and Abigail had agreed on that without needing to discuss it much. Neither of them was a person who needed ceremony. They were people who needed truth, and the truth didn't require an audience. Ruth Granger was there. Dr. Henley made the ride from town. The Carter children stood together in the yard, Ben between Emily and Lucas. Lucas with his hand on his little brother's shoulder, in the unconscious protective way he had Emily in a dress she'd asked Abigail to help her press the night before. When the minister got to the part that mattered, Emily reached over and took Abigail's hand on one side and Nathan's on the other, without being asked, without any ceremony about it. Just reached out and connected them all in one unbroken line. Ben looked up at Lucas. Lucas looked back down at him. A moment passed between them that neither of them would have been able to articulate, but both would remember for the rest of their lives. Something settled, something completed. Nathan looked at Abigail when the moment came. He looked at her the way he'd been learning to look at things he valued directly, without flinching, without the old instinct to manage the feeling back behind glass. "I thought you were the wrong woman," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It arrived and he said it. "The morning you stepped off that coach, I had already decided." "I know," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "About as wrong as a man can be." "Yes," she said with the small smile that had taken him 3 weeks to earn the first time, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life earning again and again. "You were." "I'm not wrong now," he said. "No," she said. "You're not." The minister finished. Nathan kissed his wife in the yard of the ranch he'd almost lost to grief and isolation, and the slow erosion of a man who had stopped believing in forward, and the 3 Carter children made 3 different kinds of noise. Ben whooped. Lucas made a sound that was mostly dignified, but not entirely, and Emily pressed her face against Abigail's arm and held there for a moment before she straightened up and smoothed her pressed dress with great composure. In the months that followed, the Carter Ranch became what it had once been, and more. The barn was rebuilt better than the original, with Lucas designing the latch system himself. The fields went in well that spring, and the cattle were healthy, and the house had warmth in it that didn't leave when the seasons changed. Abigail wrote to Clara Hobbs in Billings, and Clara Hobbs wrote back, and the conversation that followed ended with a small clinic established in Harlow itself, 2 mornings a week, with Abigail Brooks Carter as its primary practitioner and Dr. Henley as its supervising physician. Women came from 3 towns over. They came with sick children and their own ailments, and sometimes with nothing specific, except the need to be in a room with someone who would look at them plainly and take what they said seriously. Abigail looked at every one of them plainly. She took everything they said seriously. Emily started braiding her own hair every morning. She was faster than Abigail had ever been. Ben learned to read well enough by summer that Lucas lost a bet he'd made with himself about the timeline, and paid it by teaching his little brother to whittle, which was how Ben ended up with 17 small, unidentifiable wooden objects on his windowsill by autumn, and a deep and abiding pride in each one. Lucas turned 13 and then 14 and grew 4 inches in a year, and Nathan started treating him less like a boy to be guided, and more like a man to be consulted. And the shift in Lucas was visible to everyone who knew him, a loosening and expansion, like a rope that had been holding something up, finally getting some slack. On the last night of that first year, Nathan and Abigail sat on the porch after the children were in bed, which had become their habit in the warmer months, just sitting together in the dark, with the enormous Montana sky overhead, not needing to fill it. "Do you know what I think about," Nathan said, "when I think about the morning you arrived?" "The letter in the drawer," she said. He smiled. She knew him. "The letter in the drawer," he said. "And the way you walked into my house like you'd been invited when you hadn't been, like you already knew you belonged here before I did." "I didn't know," she said. "I hoped." "What made you hope?" She thought about it. "Ben's voice," she said. "I heard him through the window when the coach was still in the yard. This small, serious voice talking about something he cared about." She paused. "A house with a child like that in it is worth fighting for." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the night settled around them both with the particular piece of people who have earned the place they are sitting. "The only person who saved my family," he said quietly, "was the woman nobody sent for, nobody wanted, nobody chose." He paused. "And the best decision I ever made was being too stubborn and too tired and too ashamed to send her back." Abigail looked up at the sky, stars from edge to edge, the kind of sky that made a person feel both small and held at the same time. "You didn't choose me," she said. "Not at first." "No," he said, "but you kept the letter in the drawer." "I kept the letter in the drawer," she smiled. "That was enough," she said. "That was always enough." And that was the truth of it, the whole truth plain and complete, and needing nothing added. A woman who had been told her entire life that she was not the right kind arrived at the one place that needed exactly what she was, and stayed and fought and held on and made it home. Not because anyone handed it to her, not because the world finally decided she deserved it, but because she walked through the door and started the fire and did not leave, and in the end, that made all the difference.